The timeless human fascination with the Ubermensch does not derive from an impulse for technical superiority, but an innate, mostly masculine, imperative to supersede his competition in the mating order, i.e., be better, by which historically meant be the better warrior than the other guy so as to earn the right to breed by accumulating more resources, and thus also denying these same advantages to your evolutionary competitors. The problem with this today is that we don't live in a warrior society anymore, and so now, similar with the transversal obsession with the post-apocalypse genre, as they are the culturally acceptable avenues through which to express these default masculine drives towards self-empowerment and explorative conquest, the infatuation with the super soldier and/or the superhero takes over from where the great conquerors, adventurers, and demigods Sinbad, Heracles, Thor, Cuchulainn, Beowulf, etc. of prior myth and legend left off. And since, as previously expounded, a modern military has exactly no practical reason to invest time, energy, or resources into creating an army of trumped-up service animals in a world where drones, AI, and AI-powered drones exist. If such a thing as an organic super soldier were ever to come into this reality at all as anything other than as the pets or living museum attractions for the AI overlords, they would likely adhere to a neo-feudal infrastructure, with our modern concepts like the standing professional military, the PMC, criminal cartel, and state militia being not so much traded out, but superseded in the popular human zeitgeist by more archaic knightly orders, chivalric courts, knightly houses, and Ronin warbands. Of course, since, as we've already thoroughly illustrated, trying to tackle, with any semblance of meaningful fidelity, every single permutable quanta of bioform available to the organic world would be the mental equivalent of trying to fit a black hole into your breast pocket. I've even gone so far as to invent my own proprietary cell technology specifically to avoid needing to grapple with this problem. I'm instead going to take a page from the God Emperor's Blessed Handbook by using the Bene Gesserit's idolization of the sacred human form as my idol template going forward. And I don't simply mean this in the hominid sense, i.e., an animal possessed of an upright stature, a bipedal, plantigrade stance, 2 arms, and a binocular head atop of a torso, but a fully systemic realization of the Quetzalcoatl, the true man, or what Friedrich Nietzsche defined as the Ubermensch, or Overman, essentially a being fully capable of self-mastery, not just in the combative sense, but in all senses, ways, and forms, from the combative to the creative, from the profane to the profound, from the mechanical to the spiritual, and everywhere and everything in between, a being who will shorten the way, the literal translation of Quetzalcoatl, and who will usher humanity through the gate onto its next stage of evolution. But as we in real life don't have the luxury of achieving enlightenment by huffing some magic space dust, or of simply taking the Emperor's seed directly into our veins, we're going to have to get more creative, or rather, more decisive and deliberate with our approach. And if you know anything about me or my works, you know what that means. It's time for everybody's favorite dialectic crutch. More lists of arbitrarily defined categories in order to avoid spiraling into philosophical vortices around orders of complexity and uncountably infinite trivial minutiae. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as usual. Let us go back and pry into this imperial colossus of a topical Bastille from the ground floor and work our way upwards. First things first, we are technically still discussing a field of engineering here, and so the core principles I've already outlined elsewhere for such processes still apply. However, for those of you who remember my YouTube video about it, or who've read the Mech Tech Bible, I've altered them somewhat to be more thorough, which is a fancy way of saying the list magically grew 130%. Now, we could sit here until the sun turns blue talking about whose build could beat up whose, but A, most of that has already been, and is continually being, discussed in as thorough detail as anyone could want elsewhere, and B, I can just bring things up organically as they become relevant because I'm not an autistic 4-year-old who will throw a tantrum if the peas ever come into contact with the mashed potatoes beyond the context of the fork. So, in the interests of not tangling this whole thing up in any more knots than I already have, I'm just going to leave that particularly nasty junkyard dog to its rest and get us along to the true meat of this matter. As I've said on so many occasions, both on YouTube and elsewhere, that it may as well be my catchphrase, as in nature, so in engineering there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And the most prevalent trade-off, in both the biological and the mechanical realms, is the balancing act between the elemental aspects of strength and speed. And just so, when it comes to the eternal dichotomy of the DPS versus tank debate, you're always going to be looking at a lopsided trichotomy of strength, speed, and stealth. A few rules of thumb regarding each of which in respective order are as follows. 1. Being conspicuous only hurts if your enemy has a big enough gun. 2. The best way to take no damage is to not stand still long enough to get hit. 3. Your teammates can't help you if they don't know there's a problem. Now, as within all things, there are exceptions to every rule, and like I said above, and will continually emphasize throughout the rest of this project, every boon always has its cost. But since I view it as such a fundamental aspect of the evolutionary design equation, I'm going to run us over a few of what I consider to be the fundamental trade-offs to consider when drafting any version of the Superman for real-world deployment. Number 1. Sword versus shield. If you've ever watched an uncensored nature documentary before, you'll have likely noticed something peculiar about the duality between the natural loadouts of the predators and the prey animals. Namely, the predators tend to opt for leaner, more flexible, agile, and stealthy builds, whereas the herbivores they hunt tend to opt for a more tanky shield wall approach. Why would this be, do you suppose? Well, the obvious answer is that prey need to play the game of life defensively, since their food is less likely to run away, and their main ops are members of their own kind come mating season, or things looking to pounce on them from the shadows and convert their succulent meat into experience points. Paradoxically, this means that the more offensive players, the predators, being optimized towards efficiency in the hunt by Darwinian selection, would primarily use smaller, stealthier weapons and have minimal armor, since it is better for them to avoid being seen by their targets until after they've already struck a fatal blow. Meanwhile, for their prey, the optimal turn is to optimize towards repelling or ideally discouraging the predator's initial attack, since a predator generally won't risk an open confrontation with something near to its own size and more heavily armed and armored. And since, on both ends, the amount of penetrative power needed to do fatal damage to the other is more or less the same, the optimal weapons for offense tend to be the smaller, more compact and dexterous teeth and claws, whereas the better options for a more defensive build are those which offer greater reach and/or body coverage, horns, antlers, spines, frills, etc. In human terms, this translates to the classic RPG duality of the spear and shield versus the bow and dagger combos, the DPS versus the tank, the ambush predator versus the persistence hunter. And although neither method is inherently superior to the other on an evolutionary basis, otherwise they wouldn't both still exist, they do fit together like the first pair of pieces in a primal puzzle of rock, paper, scissors gun, with the second pair being the dichotomy between the stone wall and the speedster archetypes for the prey side. Now, in what you'll likely notice as a running theme, since the best way to avoid taking damage is simply to avoid being hit, and since if this was always an option, nobody would ever bother wearing armor, the actual best option is a compromise based on the mission profile, enemy types, and the respective damage probability thereof. And since I'm sure you're probably wondering why I didn't call this section something like the immovable object versus the unstoppable force, the answer is very simple. This is a mechanical grimoire, not a philosophical doctrine, and since there's no such thing as an unstoppable force or an immovable object in real-world physics, there's no practical sense in factoring such mathematical absurdities into our equations. Number 2. Strength versus speed. As I said over in the Mech Tech Bible, for various reasons pertaining to math and physics, any force-carrying device or apparatus, be it a winch, a pulley or gear train, a solenoid, a piston, a muscle, or whatever else have you, is always either going to be fast but weak or slow but strong. And of course, this is before we consider the problems of overall body size, proportionality, and leverage, each of which will play a monumental role in the amplitude and dexterity of a muscle's force applicability. Obviously, a larger body frame can support a greater volume of muscle. Longer limbs allow for not only the same, but also for more connectivity room for the ligaments, and having deeper anchors enables greater exertion without increased risk of injury. However, because force equals mass times velocity squared, a trifold increase in striking speed translates to both an exponential increase in striking power as well as an exponential decrease in the probability of taking damage. Also, since strength and mass are directly proportional, where muscle density and speed are proportioned more by things like leverage and specific momentum, speedsters tend to experience less diminished returns than tanks per proportionate gains. Of course, the innate counterplay to their core strat is that while necessarily not a glass cannon on account of needing to tank their own generated momentum should the attack fail to penetrate, think of a karate chop striking but failing to break a concrete slab, then the full force of the blow will double back due to the need for energy and mass to be conserved, effectively meaning they will have just punched themselves with the equivalent to 18x the force-mass ratio. So they need to be extra mindful of Sun Tzu's advice to meet hard with soft and soft with hard, lest they be treated to a spicy dose of their own medicine, a weakness their heavier and hardier brethren objectively doesn't share. Number 3. Cover versus concealment. To be seen or not to be seen, that is the question. And while it is technically correct that you can't hit what you can't see, That's only if it never occurs to you to shoot in its direction in the first place, as bullets have no such limitations. If you're standing in the way of the bullet, then neither the gun nor the shooter needs to be aware of your presence. The outcome will be the same. This in mind, concealment guards you only from observation, while cover physically guards you from direct, aka line of sight, attacks. Their most obvious pros and cons being that concealment can be more readily made portable, camouflage, while mobile cover, tanks, body armor, shields, etc. afford you a greater error margin and thus grant a greater degree of tactical flexibility in actually engaging the enemy. It's worth noting here that in an era of rapidly advancing electronic detection technology, true and effective concealment is rapidly becoming as practically untenable as true and effective ballistic protection. Essentially, when you live in a world where things like LiDAR, radar, sonar, thermal imaging, Ultra HD cameras, and AI image processing all exist, and all of these can be readily miniaturized and mounted onto remote, autonomous drones, you've about as much of a chance of actually convincing a near-peer adversary you're a bush as you have of bouncing an anti-tank round off your AR-500 chest plate. Number 4. Quality versus quantity. If you've made any cursory trip down the myriad online rabbit holes of WW2 history, lore, nerdom, etc., you'll have doubtlessly encountered the infamous phrase, German engineering. And if you explore just a little bit further, you'll find a pair of notorious dichotomies, that of the Panzer IV versus Sherman, whose more modern incarnation includes things like the seemingly evergreen war nerd debates. AK versus AR, 100 men versus 1 guerrilla, Custodes squad versus Tyrannid swarm, Commando squad versus Stormtrooper brigade, Russian versus German design philosophy, etc., etc. The common denominator of all being the foundational question that has underpinned nearly all military matters since the dawn of organized warfare. Do you devote the best part of your finite time and resources toward cultivating a small but elite fighting force, or do you pour them into a larger pot to churn out endless waves of disposable cannon fodder? Well, if you know anything about actual military history and are aware that there are in fact many more players in that long game than the Americans, Nazis, and ancient Romans, you'll know that the optimum solution, and as a consequence the most prevalent solution, is a
Both is good.
i.e., armies that rely solely on disposable meat shields tend to only operate in degrees of strategic hammers as, believe it or not, people who've been press-ganged into a life or death service against their will and better judgment don't make the most reliable combatants as they're less inclined to take risks, and they need to be constantly monitored lest they desert or slack off. But at the same time, if 3/4 of your droid, clone, orc, or bioswarm legions get wiped out in a single engagement, it won't break the back of your entire army since, as long as your logistical and manufacturing facilities remain intact, you can always just make or grow some more to replenish those losses. And number 5, the specialist versus the generalist. The old dog, one-trick pony versus the jack of all trades. Many people, upon first being confronted with this problem, tend to see it as a zero-sum game, as seen in the time-tested maxims, don't put all your eggs in one basket, or don't spread yourself too thin. But while these bits of folk wisdom may each be perfectly sensible in their own rights, what they fail to articulate on their own is that the generalist and specialist are not just mirrored sides of a coin, but rather are more to each other what the hand is to the arm or the brain is to the eye. The former have greater dexterity, versatility, and utility, while the latter have greater strength, reach, and leverage. However, where the real dynamic of this duo lies is in the dualism between their respective short and long-term viability and competitiveness. In the immediate and short term, the specialist reigns supreme as they are equipped with the specific arsenal of features and attributes that allows them to most optimally and efficiently leverage their unique environment and circumstances to fullest effect. Meanwhile, in the long term, the generalist ultimately wins out since, while they will always be behind the specialist in any specific area, they radically outcompete the specialists in every other area, since the bandwidth their skill sets cover is far broader. In other words, what the generalist wants for in efficiency, they compensate for with a broader playable field, and thus a far greater margin for error. Take, for example, the difference between a general laborer, a construction worker, a farmhand, a cook, a GP, etc., and a technical specialist, a plumber, a coder, etc. While the latter may enjoy higher salaries on aggregate than the former, they also become obsolete, and so has to completely reinvent themselves from the ground up when whatever system they're optimized for gets updated or replaced. The former's ability to operate equally effectively in any setting, wherein the only hard and fast requirement is experience with the contents of a basic toolbox and a common-sense comprehension of cause and effect, means they can more readily toggle between jobs or more easily transliterate between professions when one contract ends or when work becomes scarce. This is why, contrary to popular belief, true obligate herbivores and carnivores are exceedingly rare in nature, as the golden rule of survival is that when you can eat anything, you can live anywhere. Also, being able to more fluidly subsist on multiple forms of sustenance, meat, berries, grains, etc., means that if a single source of calories suddenly becomes less abundant, they'll at least be able to stave off starvation long enough to wait for the good times to return. It's also why the vast majority of warriors throughout time have taken it upon themselves to train with a wide assortment of weapons. The prudent knight or samurai would at least put some nominal work in on developing their archery, horsemanship, and unarmed combat skills, in addition to their main lance, polearm, and sword arts training. And with that, I'll leave us off for another day. Like and subscribe, buy my books and merch and all that other jazz. Next time we'll be back with the actual constructive meat of this project. But until then, my friends, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, in a world where lions tend sheep, a lone wolf shouldn't make plans to grow old. Peace be upon you.